Is the word of the Lord. And we've been going through the 7 letters to the 7 early churches in the book of Revelation to see what God and what Jesus wants his community to look like. You remember, in the later Revelation, he calls us, his community, he calls us his bride, and he's the groom. And what he wants us to say is, this is the way I want you to dress, this is the way I want you to look, this is how I want you to adorn yourself, this is what I want you to focus on as a community, to be my community, to be my church. And most of all these churches that we've seen, Jesus says, well, you're doing some things okay, and some things you think you're doing okay, but you're really not. Let me tell you what you need to fix. And what we found each and every week is that the church, when they lose sight of the gospel, when they're not daily eating up the beautiful truth that God and Jesus died on the cross, that Jesus sacrificed his life for you and I, for these churches, they wither and they die. They fade. They may look good on the outside, but inside they're rotting away. They've either given up their lordship to their jobs, to their social relationships, to whatever else they can rule them in the world except for the one true God. And each week Jesus is ushering them back into his arms and saying, I am your true lover. I am your true groom. And if you forget that, you will never live the life that you ought to live. You'll never be the community that you ought to be. And so today we actually have an interesting letter. This is the one letter where Jesus has nothing bad to say about this church. So we get a week off, right? We can take a breath. Jesus is not saying anything bad about this church. He actually only has good things to say. They've been patient. They've endured. They've been faithful. They're doing everything right, not just on the outside, but on the inside. And he even says, even though they're weak, they're still strong in his eyes. But there's still something we can learn today from the church in Philadelphia, from something that Jesus is trying to teach them and show them about their lives, and specifically their lives in their city. Now, I as a preacher haven't talked about this that much, but if you know these 7 letters, they're all written to churches that are located in major cities. These are not churches that are out in the wilderness or out in farmland. There are churches right in the middle of the city. And as we've seen, by being a church in the city, each of these churches encounters various obstacles, challenges that threaten their faith. If you remember the church in Thyatira, their faith was threatened by their jobs. In order to succeed at their jobs and in their careers, they had to worship in the temple, and Jesus says, you can't do that. I have to be your true temple. But their jobs were becoming their Lord. Their jobs were putting fear and pressure onto them. The church in Pergamum was a church that was a city that believed in relative truth. Everything was true. Whatever you thought was true at the time, whatever was convenient for you was okay. And Jesus says, no, that's not the case. See, Jesus knows that in the city, when you and I live in cities as a community, we're faced with unique challenges. We're faced with obstacles on how to live our faith out as a community in the midst of a city. And why? Because Jesus knows this. This is probably why he's writing to these churches in the cities. Cities are powerful places. Cities are places where culture challenges you every day, where the pace of life challenges you every day, where you're bumping into people getting on and off the subway. You're bumping into people on the street corners. You're constantly being challenged and stressed and tried by living in cities. And Jesus writes to this city of Philadelphia, which is a unique city from the other 7 because of where it stood geographically. It was on a major trade route, on a major trade hub that connected the west to the east. And its nickname, the city of Philadelphia, was Little Athens, Athens, Greece. And what it was, the city of Philadelphia was built as a missionary city to transmit, to promote Greek culture to the east. Basically, the city founders got together and said, if we're ever going to give Greek culture and the beauty of Greek culture to the east, to the rest of the world, it'll happen through this city. It'll happen through Philadelphia. And this is why Jesus talks about an open door. He gives them this picture of an open door because he knows He knows that the city of Philadelphia is an open door of Greek culture to the rest of the world. And Jesus is challenging the city of Philadelphia, the church in Philadelphia. He's challenging them to say, you think you are exchanging culture only, but you as my body and as my church are to exchange my values, you're to exchange my gospel truth to the rest of the world. See, living in a city, we know that the city most often is where culture is born and culture is exchanged. Look at this group. Look how many people come from across the world to gather in the city of Seoul to interchange culture. And it would have been the exact same thing in the city of Philadelphia. The East met the West, and you would have had people exchanging culture, exchanging values, talking about their lives, sharing traditions. And Jesus says, this is the perfect opportunity for you to share my values, to share my traditions, and to share my gospel. And he gives them in verse 8 this open door to do so. I want to look today at what an open door means. Now, many people, as I've read sermons about this particular passage, and I remember sermons, they preach that the open door is a missionary door. And so the sermons go something like this. Traditional churches will say something like this. You have an open door before you, so pack your bags, go to the far ends of the earth, and convert them to Christianity. Go away, go out and do that. Now, nothing's wrong with that. I do believe that that's true. We ought to do missions works. But Jesus, you know what he says here? He says, if you stay in my temple, you're never going to go out. He says, people are going to come bow down to you. He says, in your city, you need to stay. Don't go. Engage with your city. Engage with your culture. Don't go out far away. Your open door is right in front of you, if you can see it, and if you can seize it. So I want to look at what the open door has to mean for us today. What does it mean for the church in Philadelphia, and what does it mean for us? And so we'll look at a few things. First, the problem of an open door, the promise of an open door, and then lastly, the power of the open door. The problem, the promise, and the power of what this open door means, and what it can mean for us. So, the problem, first of all, because the church in Philadelphia was faithful. He says, you've been faithful. But he says, there's doors that are going to be shut in your face if you're faithful. Remember the situation of these early Christians. They were Jewish converts, so their families, if your family was Jewish and you decided to convert to Christianity, to this new religion called the Way, your family would say, no, leave, get out of here. And they would shut the door on you, literally. You could be disowned from your own family for taking up this new faith. And so the city of Philadelphia, the church here, most likely had the doors of their family life shut in their face. The doors of the synagogue. They went to the synagogue every week to worship. Now when they go as a Christian, they're told, no, you can't come in here. And the door is shut. Furthermore, also because the city of Philadelphia practiced worshiping of the emperor, they worshiped the emperor, they worshiped other gods. If you were a Christian and you said, no, I refuse to worship the emperor, I worship only God and God alone, the government could shut you down. The government could shut the doors of your business, they could shut you out of your schooling, they could shut you out of your life, everything. You could lose your money, you could lose your jobs. So these people in Philadelphia, because they're being faithful to God, are most likely having every door slammed in their face. Now, if you are anything like me, what happens when people shut the door in your face? When people snub you, when people reject you, when that job says, no, I don't want to hire you, I'm going to hire this person. When the friendship says, no, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. When your family shuts the door on you, what do you do? What do we do? If you're anything like me, you act like a little 2-year-old probably. You close your arms and you say, fine, I don't want you either. See, Jesus knows that when he's talking to this church, he uses the metaphor of an open door because he knows that as every door gets shut in the life of this church, they are prone to then shut the door back to the culture around them. They're prone, this church would be likely to say, okay, fine, if the culture is going to reject me, then I'm going to reject it. I don't want it. I don't want to be a part of this city. I don't want to be a part of this life. I'll go to church. I'll be faithful. I will go to church every day, I'll hang out with Christians, I'll pray with people, that's fine. But I will not engage with this culture that rejects me. I reject the rejecter. Jesus knows this will be true. And that's why he's writing to them saying, no, this door must remain open for you. See, the problem with a door is that it can go both ways. People can shut us out, or we as Christians, what we most often do, can shut them out. Shut out the city, shut out the culture, because it's easy to do that. But something very bad happens when we do that. Max Lucado is a Christian writer, and he gave a story one time about how he went on a fishing trip with his father and his father's friend. And the father's friend had a young son about his age. They went on a fishing trip, and they went in a camper, a camper van. It's got the kitchen and everything in it, and you can basically live out of it. They went far away for this fishing trip, and he says the entire week it rained. It rained so badly that they couldn't go fishing, they couldn't even barely leave the camper, and they were stuck inside this little tiny room. And if you've ever been stuck inside a tiny room with somebody for a week, you know what happens? You fight. You begin to see the small things that they do, and you begin to bicker when the door is shut. And he writes, and it's a long quote, but I put it in your bulletin. And he writes that he says, I learned a hard lesson that week. Not about fishing, but about people. When those who are called to fish don't fish, they fight. When energy intended to be used outside is used inside, the result is explosive. Instead of casting nets, we cast stones. Instead of extending helping hands, we point accusing fingers. Instead of being fishers of the lost, we become critics of the saved. Rather than helping the hurting, we hurt the helpers. The result? Church Scrooges, bah humbug spirituality, beady eyes searching for warts on others while ignoring the warts on the nose below. Crooked fingers that bypass strengths and point out weaknesses, split churches, poor testimonies, broken hearts, legalistic wars, and sadly, poor go unfed, confused go uncounseled, and lost go unpreached. When those who are called to fish don't fish, they fight. What he's saying here, and what Jesus knows when he's talking to this church in Philadelphia, he's saying, you are in the middle of this wonderful city where culture is being born and exchanged. And if you choose to shut your door, if you choose to say, here's my life, here's my faith, and here's the culture, but never the two shall meet, if you say that, you won't survive. You'll fight. You'll wither. You'll die. Jesus is writing to churches that are in cities because he's concerned with how you and I use our resources, our time, our energy, our jobs to engage the city, to engage the culture around us. Or do we simply say, that door is shut. I don't need to do it. The problem with a door is that it can be shut either from people looking at us as Christians, but more often than not, it's us as Christians who say, you know what, it's just too hard. I don't see how my job's important. My job's not going to redeem or fix this entire city. My energy and my time can't be used to fix and redeem this entire city. So why bother? Why do it? If that's the problem of an open door, what's the promise? What is he saying to the church in Philadelphia and to you and I about what we can do with this open door of opportunity? See, when he's talking to this church and this city, he knows that they're an important city for giving and transmitting this culture, for changing people's lives. And by giving the church the open door, he's saying, you're doing everything right. You're doing so many good things. And because you are in a perfect position in your life right now, in your jobs, with your relationships, to make a difference, to change things. Not just to consume and take from the city, but to give back to it. Robert Bella is a sociologist, a very famous sociologist, and he's from the University of California in Berkeley. And he focuses mainly on Korea and Japan. So his job, his whole life has been to look at these two countries and to try to understand how religious movements affect them and how religious movements have changed the nature of those cities. And he looks specifically at Japan, and he looks at religion in general. but he quoted, he looked at Japan and he looked back at how trade unions and how women's movements were started in Japan, and he found, and he looked across all religions, but he found that it was the Protestant and Catholic Christian movements that helped start and change the trade unions and the women's movements in Japan. And he makes a note of this, saying that it's remarkable because the Christian population of Japan is only 2%. Less than 2%, depending on who you ask. So as a sociologist, he makes an interesting observation to say, even this small group of people can change radical institutional, have institutional change and effect. Even this small percentage. And Jesus looks at this church and says, though you are weak, the church in Philadelphia, though you are weak, you can do this too. You can change things. The promise is that if we look to Jesus as our Lord and Savior, and if we look to Him to say, what is our open door? How can we use our lives to change the lives of those around us? He's saying, you can have an impact beyond anything that you ever imagined. Beyond anything you ever believed would come true. How do we get that? How do we capture that promise? If the promise is that we can do amazing things as Christians in the city, in your job, in your school, in your relationships, where you are right now, you can change everything, the culture of the city. If that's the promise, how do we get that? How do we get the power, the motivation to do that? You notice in verse 10, if you look, Jesus points out to he says this synagogue of Satan, meaning the Jews who had turned on these Christian converts, the people who were closing the doors on them, the city, the people around it, their very culture. He says, they will come and they will bow down to you. And that's another way to say, they will come and they will listen to you. They will look at you and say, something's different in your life. But he doesn't say that they'll come and do it because the church is successful, or the church is strong, or the church has a lot of members. He doesn't say that at all. You notice in verse 10 what he says. He says, they will come and bow down to you, and why? They will see that I have loved you. Now the tense of that verb, I have loved, in Greek, is not that it happens all the time, but that it happened one time. It started at one point in history, Jesus says. I have loved you already. He says, don't you get it? The culture around you, the city around you, is never going to care about you as a community of believers. They're never going to be changed by you in the radical way that they can. If you don't look at the fact that I first loved you, they will come and see that I loved you. And I did it once and for all on the cross for you. See, you and I have a choice. We live in this city of Seoul. We have a choice. We can either take from the city and consume the city. We can either take everything that the city has to offer us and be consumers, or we can sacrifice ourselves for the sake of the city, to change it, to grow it, to redeem it, in our jobs and our relationships, in the mundane, everyday things. And Jesus knows, when he says, they will know that I have loved you, he's saying the only way you're going to make a difference here is if people can see that I first loved you on the cross. Jesus came to the earth and he had a chance to consume. He could have taken. He was the king. He could have taken power, authority. He could have started a mega church. He could have had a huge church. He could have converted millions of people in the world. But he didn't choose to consume. He chose to sacrifice for you and for me. The simple fact that Jesus first loved us is the only thing that's going to change the hearts and the minds of those around us when they see that we're motivated by the grace and mercy of the gospel and that alone. But there's actually something even more beautiful here. In verse 12, you notice that Jesus says that he will make us a pillar in his temple, and it will never go out. And this is a direct reference to the city of Philadelphia because the city stood on the edge of a volcano, an active volcano. And there were always earthquakes happening in this city. People lived in the city of Philadelphia because the soil around the volcano was fertile. You could have a good living. You could be a good farmer, a good merchant. So people went into the city, but at the same time, the city of Philadelphia was subject to frequent earthquakes. And there's actually historical records of families, whole entire families, who would every night pack up their most valuable items and leave the city every night because they were afraid of an earthquake happening as they slept and the building that they were sleeping in falling down and killing them, destroying them. See, the city of Philadelphia lived in a constant fear that the very things they built up their city with, their buildings, their temples, their banks, their institutions, everything could come crumbling down on them in a moment's notice. This was their fear. And yet Jesus says, if you know that I first loved you, you can rest in my temple. And when he says you'll never go out of it, the people in Philadelphia will have read this and said, wow, you mean we never have to leave at night? We never have to be afraid again that the things around us can come crumbling down and destroy us. Jesus is basically saying, the very things you trust in, your city, your buildings, your culture, your money, your bank account, your jobs, your talents, all of those things can come crushing down on you, and they will come crushing down on you if you do not rest in my temple. If you don't see that I've given you an open door of opportunity to redeem the city around you by my grace because I first loved you. He says that people will see that he has first loved us because we kept his patient word of endurance. And that word endurance in verse 9 here is the same exact word used in Hebrews 12, 1 through 2, when the writer of Hebrews says, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Jesus knows that this city, just like us, this church, just like us, if they rely on anything else to give them value, to give them comfort, to give them security, at night it will come crushing down on them. This is why you and I have fears. This is why you and I have anxieties about our jobs, about our relationships. It's because we've stopped seeing the one who endured on the cross for us, and we instead are trying to endure for our own selves. We stopped seeing the one who first loved us on the cross, and instead we're trying to find that love, that comfort, and the security in whatever other places we can find it. But Jesus says, if you come back to me, if you know that I first loved you on the cross, if you know that I endured for you, you will then endure for other people. If you knew that I first loved you, you will then love other people. You will then go out to serve. You'll be changed. How does this practically affect you? Starting tomorrow morning, everybody here is probably going to go back to their jobs or their schools. How does this change you? Well, it's personal. You have to ask yourself, why am I here at my job right now? At this moment, at this time? Am I here just to take from people, or am I here to serve people? Am I here just to earn money, or am I here to give back money? Am I here to get from people or to give to people? That's a personal application that you can apply to yourself, but one story that may help this come to life or apply to you. I'm a huge soccer fan. I love soccer, and I love the World Cup. So imagine the World Cup finals happening, and just for argument's sake that the United States is playing Korea. It'll never happen, I know, but just say that it does. Okay, now I'm rooting for the United States. I'm so, fighting for them to win the game. Nothing against Korea, but I want the United States to win, right? But say at that time I have to go to church or I have another event, so I record the game. I record this World Cup final, United States and Korea. I record it, and I tell all my friends, don't tell me the score. Shh, don't tell me. I turn off my internet, I turn off my phone. I do everything I can do to not know the score. I go home, I turn it on, and I have one obnoxious friend who comes in the room and says, oh, wasn't that a great game? The U.S. won 3-0. And I look at the friend, and first of all, I'm angry at him or her, but I watch the game anyway. Now, as the game gets towards the end, the United States is up 3-0. What happened? What if I start to get worried? What if I start to sweat? What if I start to get anxious, nervous? You would look at me and say, Eric, what is your problem? You already know the way the story ends. You already know the outcome of the game. Why are you worried? Why are you stressing out? I just told you they won. It's the same in our Christian lives. When we worry about our work, when we worry about our lives, our relationships, Jesus looks at us and he says, don't you get it? You know the way the story ends. I've already loved you. It's done. What more do you have to worry about? And he says, when you worry, it's like losing sight of that soccer game. You know the outcome. In your heart of hearts, you know that I loved you. In your heart of hearts, you know that I went to the cross for you. So why are you worried? Is it because you lost sight of me? It's because you've forgotten what I've endured for you. And as silly as it would be for me to worry about the outcome of that game after my friend had already told me the score, Jesus kind of looks at us and says, it's silly for you to worry, to be riddled with anxiety. He says, instead, look, you're weak. And in your weakness, I give you this open door. You can do amazing, wonderful things in my name, in your city, in your culture right now, if you rely on my cross and my cross alone. If you know that I already endured the greatest thing ever in the world, death on a cross for you. When you know that, when you know the end of the story, it makes life all that much sweeter to live. Just pray with me. Lord, we're challenged.